Imagine a world where one single family owns more real estate than BlackRock. A family that controls the banks of Italy, the gold of Mexico, the ports of the Netherlands, and the souls of half of Europe. They didn't have a tech startup. They didn't have a space program. They had something better, a marriage bed and a name that made kings tremble. The Habsburgs. To the average American, history is something that happened 200 years ago. But for the Habsburgs, 2 centuries was just a single business cycle. They didn't just rule empires, they created the very concept of a global superpower. Long before the British Empire or the United States, there was the House of Habsburg. They were the ultimate venture capitalists of the Middle Ages. Their strategy wasn't war, it was mergers and acquisitions through marriage. But as we're about to find out, when you keep all the power, the money, and the blood inside the room for too long, things get dark, fast. By 1519, the startup phase was over. Enter Charles V. At age 19, Charles inherits Spain and all its newfound colonies in the Americas, the Holy Roman Empire, Germany, Austria, parts of France, the Netherlands, southern Italy. He was literally the first person to rule an empire on which the sun never set. For my American audience, think of Charles V as the ultimate CEO. His company produced the world's silver, controlled the world's religion, and dictated global trade. But being the CEO of the world is a nightmare. Charles spent his entire life on a horse. He was fighting the French in the west, the Ottoman Turks in the east, and a new disruptor in his own backyard, a monk named Martin Luther. This was the first tech war of history. The printing press was the internet of the 1500s, and it was spreading Protestantism like a viral tweet. Charles tried to censor it with the Inquisition, but the cat was out of the bag. But here is where the story takes a tragic human turn. Charles was overwhelmed. He had too much debt, too many wars, too many responsibilities, too much power for one human brain. In a move that shocked the world, he did what no modern dictator would ever do. He resigned. He split the empire in 2, gave half to his brother and half to his son, and went to a monastery to listen to clocks chime until he died. But he left behind a fatal flaw in the family DNA, a flaw that was about to turn the original 1% into a cautionary tale of biological bankruptcy. This is the story of the most powerful dynasty in human history. A story of unimaginable wealth, a biological horror story of genetic collapse, and a warning to every empire that thinks it's too big to fail. Let's rewind to the year 1020. Forget the castles of Vienna for a second. We are in northern Switzerland, in a place called Aargau. A minor count named Radbot builds a small fortress, Habsburg or Hawk's Castle. At this point, the Habsburgs are nobodies. They are middle management in the feudal system, but Radbot and his descendants had a Wall Street mindset. While other lords were busy dying in mud-soaked battles over a few acres of land, the Habsburgs were looking at the map. In 1273, they caught their big break. Rudolf I was elected King of Germany. Why? Because the other electors thought he was too weak to cause trouble. They wanted a puppet. Biggest mistake ever. Rudolf used his position to seize Austria. He moved the family HQ to Vienna, turning a minor regional brand into a dominant player. He understood that in the Game of Thrones, land is the only currency that never devalues. But it was Maximilian I, the great consolidator, who cracked the code of world domination. He didn't use cannons, he used wedding rings. He married Mary of Burgundy, bringing in the richest real estate in Europe, the Netherlands and Belgium. His logic was simple. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry. Think about that for a second. This is the 15th century version of a hostile takeover. You don't need an army if you own the heir to the rival company. By the time Maximilian's grandson, Charles, was born, the Habsburgs were sitting on a portfolio that would make a modern billionaire look like a pauper. After Charles V stepped down, the family split into two massive subsidiaries, Habsburg Spain and Habsburg Austria. His son, Philip II, took the Spanish side, and for a while, it looked like he hit the ultimate jackpot. This was the era of the conquistadors. Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro were basically Philip's regional managers in the Americas. They dismantled the Aztec and Inca empires and turned a continent into a massive resource extraction site. Imagine the cash flow. Between 1500 and 1650, Spain imported roughly 180 tons of gold and 16,000 tons of silver from the New World. In modern terms, we're talking about trillions of dollars. But here's the lesson for the Wall Street crowd. Money isn't value. Philip II thought he was the richest man in history, but he accidentally invented hyperinflation. The massive influx of silver made the currency lose its value. Prices in Europe skyrocketed. While the Habsburgs were spending billions on religious wars and building the Escorial, a palace so big it had 1,200 doors, their economy was rotting from the inside. Spain declared bankruptcy 4 times during Philip's reign. Think about that. The rulers of the world's gold mines couldn't pay their bills. It was the first too big to fail collapse in history. Now we have to talk about the elephant in the room, or rather, the jaw in the room. The Habsburgs had a problem. They owned the world, but they didn't want to share it. To keep their titles and territories from leaking out to other families, they stopped looking for outside talent. They decided to merge only with themselves. In the boardrooms of the 16th century, uncle married niece. First cousins married first cousins. For nearly 200 years, the Spanish Habsburgs engaged in a level of inbreeding that would make a lab rat blush. They thought they were preserving pure blood. In reality, they were creating a genetic time bomb. Look at their portraits. It starts subtly, a slightly long chin, a heavy lower lip. This became known as the Habsburg Jaw, prognathism. By the third generation, it wasn't just a facial feature, it was a disability. They could barely chew their food. They drooled, they struggled to speak. But the physical deformity was only the surface. The real damage was the high rate of infant mortality and the loss of mental stability. The Habsburg Board of Directors was literally losing its mind because they refused to diversify their DNA portfolio. The ultimate result of this experiment was Charles II of Spain, born in 1661. If this were a corporate drama, Charles II was the incompetent heir who finally liquidates the company. He was so inbred, his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of a child born to a brother and sister, that he could barely walk. He was known as El Hechizado, the Bewitched. He was mentally delayed, physically frail, and completely sterile. The world's superpowers, France and England, sat like vultures, watching him, literally waiting for him to die so they could carve up his assets. When Charles II finally passed away in 1700 at age 38, he left no children. The Spanish branch of the Habsburgs was biologically bankrupt. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a global conflict that was basically a massive lawsuit settled with cannons. The Habsburgs lost Spain forever. The original 1% had played the game of mergers and acquisitions so aggressively that they deleted their own future. While the Spanish branch was literally drooling themselves into extinction, the Austrian Habsburgs were facing a different kind of hostile takeover. We're talking about 1683. The Ottoman Empire, the biggest disruptor in the East, had brought 150,000 soldiers to the very front door of Vienna. Imagine the scene. Vienna was the headquarters of Western civilization. If the walls fell, the Habsburg brand was dead. The Emperor, Leopold I, was not a warrior. He was a man who loved opera and theology. He was a soft CEO in a hard market. He fled the city, leaving the defense to his managers. For 2 months, the city was a hellscape. Underground, Ottoman miners were planting explosives. Above ground, the Viennese were eating their horses. This was the ultimate stress test for the dynasty. And then, at the last possible second, the bailout arrived. King John III. Sobieski of Poland led the largest cavalry charge in history down the hills of Vienna. The Ottomans were crushed. But here is the interesting thing about the Habsburgs. They didn't just win a war, they rebranded it. They used this victory to claim they were the shield of Christendom. It was a PR masterstroke. From that moment on, the Austrian branch didn't just rule land, they ruled a mission. And that mission gave them another 200 years of life. By 1740, the family hit a massive legal loophole. The Salic law stated that a woman could not inherit the company assets. But the Emperor Charles VI had a problem. He had no sons. He spent the last 10 years of his life traveling across Europe, bribing other kings to sign a document called the Pragmatic Sanction. Essentially, he was asking the world to allow his daughter, Maria Theresa, to take over the family business. Everyone signed it. And the second Charles died, everyone broke their promise. They saw a young woman on the throne and thought, easy pickings, let's liquidate the Habsburgs. They underestimated her. Maria Theresa was 23, pregnant, and had zero military training. But she had the Habsburg iron in her blood. She didn't just hold the empire together, she modernized it. She realized that the old feudal model was obsolete. She built schools, reformed the tax code, and turned the military into a professional machine. But her biggest contribution to the family legacy, she was a breeding machine. She had 16 children, 16. She used them like pieces on a chessboard. One daughter was sent to Naples, another to Parma, and the most famous one, Maria Antonia, better known as Marie Antoinette, was sent to France to secure an alliance with the Bourbons. For a moment, it looked like the Habsburgs had won. They had hacked the system, but they were about to face a disruptor that no marriage could fix. The French Revolution and a short man from Corsica named Napoleon. Fast forward to 1848. The world is changing. Steam engines are replacing horses. Democracy is replacing kings. The Habsburgs are now legacy media in a digital age. Franz Joseph I takes the throne at 18. He would stay there for 68 years. Think about that tenure. He started his career writing with a goose feather and ended it in a world of telephones and airplanes. Franz Joseph was the ultimate bureaucrat emperor. He woke up at 4 a.m. every day to work on files. He was obsessed with the process, but his personal life was a succession-level nightmare. His wife, Empress Elizabeth, Sisi, was the world's first celebrity royal. She was the Princess Diana of the 19th century. She was obsessed with her beauty, hated the strict Habsburg court, and spent her life running away from Vienna. Then, the Black Swan event happened. Their only son and heir, Crown Prince Rudolf, was found dead in a hunting lodge in a double suicide with his teenage mistress. This is the Meiling incident. It destroyed Franz Joseph. The heir was gone. The future of the company was blank. By 1914, the Habsburg Empire was a zombie corporation. It looked big on the map, but inside it was a mess of a dozen different nationalities who all wanted a divorce. The new heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was a man who wanted to fix the company. He had a plan for a United States of Greater Austria. He wanted to give everyone a seat at the table, but he went to Sarajevo. 2 bullets, one for him, one for his wife. The Habsburgs triggered World War I not because they were strong, but because they were desperate to prove they weren't irrelevant. 4 years later, the company was liquidated. The emperor was exiled. The maps were redrawn. 1,000 years of power ended with a signature on a piece of paper in a forest in France. The year is 1914. While the rest of the world sees a map of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the man at the top sees a balance sheet written in blood. Franz Joseph I is 84 years old. In corporate terms, he is the CEO who refused to retire until the building started burning down around him. He had been in power for 66 years. To put that in perspective for an American audience, he took the throne when James K. Polk was president and stayed there until the era of Woodrow Wilson. He saw the birth of the light bulb, the car, the telephone, and the machine gun. But by 1914, he was a ghost inhabiting a palace. Think about the psychological state of this man. His brother, Maximilian, was executed by a firing squad in Mexico. His only son, Rudolf, committed suicide in a pact that stained the family name forever. His wife, the beautiful Cece, was stabbed to death by an anarchist with a sharpened file. And now, his nephew and heir, Franz Ferdinand, has been deleted in Sarajevo. When Franz Joseph signed the declaration of war against Serbia, he didn't do it with the fire of a conqueror. He did it with the resignation of a man closing a bankrupt factory. He famously said, "If we must go under, we shall go under decently." That is the Habsburg mindset. The brand is more important than survival. For the next 2 years, the emperor lived a life of brutal clockwork monotony. He woke up at 4 a.m., prayed, drank a cup of coffee, and sat at his desk. He reviewed thousands of files while millions of his subjects were dying in the muddy trenches of the Eastern Front and the freezing peaks of the Alps. The Austrian army was a logistical nightmare. It was a multinational corporation where the employees couldn't speak to each other. Officers gave orders in German to soldiers who spoke Czech, Hungarian, Serbo-Croatian, Polish, and Italian. It was the Tower of Babel with bayonets. In 1916, in the middle of the Great War, the old CEO finally clocked out. Franz Joseph died of pneumonia. The funeral was the last great spectacle of the 19th century. A sea of black plumes, golden carriages, and silent crowds. As his coffin was carried into the imperial crypt in Vienna, the world realized that the old Europe was being buried with him. The Habsburg Corporation was now leaderless in the middle of a global meltdown. Imagine being hired as the CEO of a company that is already $100 billion in debt, the warehouse is on fire, and the board of directors is trying to kill you. That was Charles I, the last emperor. He was young, he was kind, and he was completely out of time. Charles was the only leader in World War I who actually tried to stop it. He knew that every day the war continued, the Habsburg DNA was being diluted. He engaged in secret negotiations with France, basically trying to negotiate a private settlement behind his partner's, Germany's, back. In the high-stakes world of 1917, this was a massive gamble. It failed. When the Sixtus affair leaked, Charles was branded a traitor by his own allies. His credibility was shot. By 1918, the Habsburg board was disintegrating. In Washington, President Woodrow Wilson issued his 14 points. One of them was the death warrant for the Habsburgs, self-determination for the peoples of Austria-Hungary. In business terms, this was a forced spin-off. Wilson told the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Poles, and the South Slavs that they didn't have to work for the Habsburg Corporation anymore. They could start their own small businesses. And they did. In October 1918, the empire didn't just lose a war, it evaporated. One day, Charles had an empire of 50 million people. The next day, he was the king of a country that didn't exist. On November 11th, 1918, the same day the armistice was signed, Charles was forced to sign a document relinquishing his participation in the government. He didn't technically abdicate, he just stepped out of the office. He packed the family silver, the crowns, and the private letters into a train and headed for the Swiss border. As the train crossed the frontier into Switzerland, 1,000 years of history were left on the tracks. The Habsburgs were no longer emperors, they were refugees with very expensive luggage. The American dream is about going from nothing to everything. The Habsburg nightmare is the exact opposite, having everything and realizing you have to pay for your own laundry. Charles Effoy's didn't handle the middle-class life well. He was obsessed with a comeback. Twice, he tried to sneak back into Hungary to reclaim the throne. Imagine a former billionaire trying to break into his old office building because he still has the key. He was caught, exiled to the remote island of Madeira, and died in poverty at the age of 34, leaving his wife, Zita, with 7 children and 0 income. This is where the story should have ended. A tragic, faded family living in the shadows of history. But the Habsburgs had one last trick up their sleeve. They were about to produce a new kind of leader, one who didn't need a crown to hold power. Enter Otto von Habsburg. Otto was the eldest son of the last emperor. He was a man who understood the new market. When Hitler rose to power, he reached out to Otto. Hitler wanted the Habsburg brand to legitimize his Third Reich. He offered Otto a deal. "Help me and I'll give you your palaces back." Otto's response was a masterclass in moral clarity. He told Hitler to go to hell. For the next decade, Otto became a freelance diplomat. He moved to the United States, became a close advisor to FDR, and worked tirelessly to ensure that Austria wouldn't be erased from the map after the war. He traded his title of Archduke for the title of public servant. He realized that in the 20th century, power isn't inherited, it's influence. While the world was still recovering from the Great War, a new shadow was rising in Europe: Adolf Hitler. Hitler was born a subject of the Habsburgs in the small town of Braunau am Inn. He grew up hating everything the Habsburgs stood for. To Hitler, the Habsburg Empire was a monstrous half-breed state because it allowed different races and religions to live together. Hitler wanted a pure Germany. The Habsburgs wanted a multinational community. This wasn't just a war of armies, it was a war of corporate philosophies. When the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, the Anschluss, Hitler's first order of business wasn't just to seize the gold, it was to hunt down Otto von Habsburg. The Nazis called their invasion Operation Otto. That is how much they feared the brand. They knew that if the people had to choose between a screaming corporal and a legitimate emperor, the corporal might lose. Otto was forced to flee through the back door of Europe. He moved to Washington, D.C. For an American audience, this is a fascinating what if. Imagine a real-life prince, the heir to 1,000 years of power, living in a suburban house in Washington, having breakfast with President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Otto became FDR's secret weapon. He briefed the American government on European psychology. He spent the war years working the halls of Congress, convincing the Americans that Austria was a victim of Nazi aggression, not a willing partner. Think about the skill required here. Otto was a man with no country, no army, and no money. All he had was a name, but he used that name to influence the outcome of the war. He proved that even when a company goes through bankruptcy, its intellectual property, its reputation, can still hold massive market value. After 1945, the Habsburgs were once again at a crossroads. The palaces were gone. The titles were technically illegal in Austria. Most people thought they were historical relics, but Otto von Habsburg was playing the long game. He looked at the map of Europe and saw two giants, the USA and the Soviet Union. He realized that if the small countries of Europe, Austria, Hungary, the Czechs, stayed isolated, they would be eaten alive. He didn't try to bring back the monarchy. He did something much more clever. He helped create the European Union. Otto became the president of the International Pan-European Union. He spent decades in the European Parliament. Critics called him a dreamer. But Otto understood that the European Union was basically the Habsburg Empire 2.0. Think about it. A huge economic area with open borders, a shared currency and multiple languages, all working under one administrative center. It was the same business model his ancestors used in the 16th century, but this time it was democratic. His greatest moment came in 1989. Otto organized the pan-European picnic on the border between Austria and Hungary. It was a PR stunt with world-changing consequences. He helped cut the barbed wire of the Iron Curtain, allowing hundreds of East Germans to escape to the west. This was the final revenge of the Habsburgs. While the Soviet corporation was collapsing, the Habsburg legacy was helping to unite the continent. Otto lived to see the fall of the Berlin Wall and died in 2011 at the age of 98. His funeral was a state event in Vienna, attended by kings, presidents, and thousands of ordinary citizens. The CEO had finally brought the brand back to its peak. So, where are the Habsburgs today? Is the corporation finally closed? Not even close. The current head of the house is Karl von Habsburg. He is a former member of the European Parliament, an expert on cultural heritage, and a media personality. His brother, Georg, is a senior diplomat. But look at the younger generation. Ferdinand Zvonimir Habsburg. He is a professional racing driver. You can see the Habsburg eagle on his car as he races in the world's most elite circuits. They are no longer the 1% in terms of political control, but they are a massive social and cultural power. They have successfully transitioned from owners of the land to keepers of the history. They represent a unique kind of venture capital, historical capital. In a world that changes every 5 minutes, there is a massive market for something that has lasted for 1,000 years. The Habsburgs have become the ultimate luxury brand of European history. They remind us that while leaders, systems, and borders are temporary, a strong family culture can survive anything. As we close the books on the House of Habsburg, we have to ask ourselves, what was the point? Was it just a story of greed and inbreeding, or was it something deeper? The Habsburgs were an experiment in human ambition. They tried to build a structure that would never fall. They failed, of course. Everything eventually falls, but they lasted longer than the Roman Empire. They lasted longer than the British Empire. They lasted longer than any corporation in existence today. They show us the limits of biology. You can own the world's gold, but you cannot outrun your own DNA. They show us the power of diplomacy. You can win more with a wedding ring than with 1,000,000 bayonets. And they show us the resilience of the human spirit. Even when you lose your palaces, your titles, and your power, you can still lead. The story of the Habsburgs is the story of US, our desire to leave a legacy, our fear of being forgotten, our struggle to hold on to what we build, the jewels, the gold, the incest, and the empires. They are all just chapters in a much larger book, a book that is still being written, because as long as there is a city called Vienna, as long as there is a united Europe, and as long as there is a man named Habsburg, the sun has not yet fully set on their story. Thank you for watching. Or rather, for witnessing the audit of history.